Let's talk about power. Power has many dimensions, so we're three very different people, three very different backgrounds around a table. So let's start with a brief introduction. My name is Sven Bisschop. I'm Belgian. I'm also Belgian-based in Brussels. I wear two hats. I'm a professor at the University of Ghent, and I'm a director of research at a think tank, the Royal Institute for International Relations, Egmont, in Brussels. And I deal with two big topics: defense, so really the most classic dimension of power, if you want, and then I deal with relations between the great powers, how to position Europe, the European Union, in the power games between China, Russia and the United States. And then of course that game has a military dimension, but also an economic dimension and a political dimension.
Thank you. My name is Lara Favaretto. I am a lawyer by training. I had built my expertise in the public sector for some years in different ministries. I moved then to the private sector, where I consolidated this expertise by working in banks, more in the regulatory environment of finance. And today I'm an independent director. I sit on different boards of different banks, and I also advise banks. So I'm coming from the financial sector.
My name is Geert Lovink. I'm a media theorist, internet critic and activist, and I run a small research unit in a Polytech, Amsterdamse Hogeschool, the HVA, and there I'm leading the Institute of Network Cultures, and I'm doing that since 2004, and I have a background in the squatters movement, in media arts, internet activism, and yeah, I'm still, here in the museum. I'm at home because I'm very closely tied to, the concerns of artists, and we spent a lot of time working with artists in my center.
All right. Now, maybe to kick us off, I was thinking that many people, in my view, they hear power and they immediately attach negative connotations to it. Maybe especially, our audience, who knows, people interested in the arts. I have a more optimist, positive view of it, and I think our problem as Europeans is rather that we have stopped to think about power, and we have forgotten a bit what power is and how to use it. Because we always think, somebody who is powerful, they begin to beat up their neighbors. A powerful country, then the first project is always, let's invade our neighbors, let's annex a province or two. But my view is rather that you need power also if you want to implement positive projects. I always like to quote the notion of realpolitik. It's another notion everybody immediately thinks, Bismarck, Kissinger, the end justifies the means. But the original meaning of the concept is very positive. The guy who invented it, German obviously, Ludwig von Rothau, he was a liberal. In 1848 there was a failed revolution in Germany, a failure to create democracy. He was involved in that, and afterwards he wrote a book about realpolitik, and he said, look, we have beautiful values, but just dreaming about them serves no purpose. You need power, and if you have power, then you can bring them into practice. If not, they will always be an illusion. So for me, this is the challenge that I see for us Europeans, is to understand that we need power in all dimensions. Classic military power also, just in case. Certainly economic power, that includes technology, certainly also political influence, and we need that power first of all to safeguard our own way of life. It's maybe a very American term, let's say the type of society that we have chosen to build. We need to preserve it and improve it. That requires power, and we need power even to pursue a constructive project for the world, because you cannot say from a position of weakness to a big power like China, I'm gonna work with you, because then the risk is very high that you will exploit them. So even if you want to engage other powers in the world, you need to be a power yourself. That's sort of my starting point in all of those dimensions. But perhaps my two co-conspirators here in the basement have already widely different opinions on that.
Yeah, I want to say something about you know, the, let's say, historic trauma of power, because in Europe, when we're talking about power, and many would say that in our generation, roughly speaking, you know, after the war, there's a trauma of power, and I think I come from a generation that clearly put it as its task to dismantle power, to question the power, to locate it, to see precisely where it is, how it's, for instance, functioning within people, in relationship between genders, race, to put it in a, you know, colonial and post-colonial perspective, and to fight the power, let's say, you know, to use the term. And yeah, this is very much connected, I believe, to Michel Foucault, you know, and he wrote in the 70s particularly, and I think his writings and his thinking about power is very, very multi-layered. And yeah, it's something that you know, I grew up with or grew into, and this whole idea of the European power, of course, is something that very many people, you know, wanted to question, because the relation between Europe and power has been pretty disastrous, in especially, you know, 18th, 19th, 20th century, or, you know, coming from the Netherlands, maybe even, you know, the 17th century for that matter. So yeah, my generation put it to task to not end the power, because if you read Foucault, you will see that power will always be generated, and there are always new and different power relations. So it's a naive idea to think that you can do away with it. But what we can do, especially as Europeans, I think, is to analyze it, to point at it, to and maybe, you know, this is navel gazing, and this you know, puts us in the situation that you just mentioned. But this is probably, you know, what's up for debate this afternoon here in the Mudam cellar.
Yes, this is all quite fascinating. I've been thinking about how this concept of power would relate to the financial world. And if I look at what happened in Europe, but then in the world also since 2009, you know, one can look at power from different points of view. So power as a force in society, and in this particular context, deregulation of finance. So in a certain sense, an abuse of power, because a certain force got out of hand and started to affect other aspects of life. Then power also in the sense of abuse of power, but then also of powerlessness. So I think it's interesting to look at also this financial crisis as a dialectic of these three dimensions of power, and then to think of how this dialectic then relates to the different protagonists in society. Who are the protagonists? There are the individuals, the institutions, and then the community or the collective. And how did this, let's say, dialectic of power affect these three protagonists in society? And if you now take, for instance, a definition that that you were alluding to in your presentation at first, when you say people associate something negative with power, then you would think of people being in positions of power, just deciding things, just doing things. Are they legitimate or not? Does it make sense or not? And of course, for many, many years, there were a lot of meetings in Brussels. There were meetings all over the world to understand how one can move from a deregulated environment to a regulated environment again. And a lot of power was used to do that. It's interesting then to think of what we have today in terms of a framework that was put in place, whether it was the consequence of power or of powerlessness. This honestly is not very clear to me yet. The only thing that I really draw from this experience is that in order for power to be meaningful and to actually lead to a constructive result, it needs to be framed, it needs to be channeled, and it needs to have a value system that it obeys. Because it's when it leaves that moral framework that power then becomes actually a negative source in society rather than a positive source in society. So maybe at a more conceptual level, this is probably true for all the forces in society, not just in the financial sector, but it is something that, looking at what happened since 2009, I could clearly see in different moments of this crisis as it was unfolding, but then also, and to some extent, there is still an aftermath of the crisis that we're still experiencing, how this concept has been building up and implemented.
It's very interesting what you say. I mean, I would say you need a project, that and power is then the tool to achieve that project, and that project can be very positive. Your project can be to build a welfare state, for example, but that requires power also, right? But of course, others have can have a negative project as well. As you say, the deregulation I find very interesting is a project of some players. Clearly, some states have old-fashioned type projects, or what we regard as old-fashioned, of creating spheres of influence and dominating other countries. I think my feeling is why many in Europe immediately look at power as something so negative, because we have of course made an honest attempt, as you said here, to overcome war among ourselves and to make sure that within our community, the European Union, we do not use power directly against each other anymore, and we've created what in academic terms we call a security community. Any dispute, any difference is settled through legal means and by peaceful means, and we have tried to make it unimaginable that you would use force against one another, and also practically impossible. It's one market. Most of it's one currency, so it's difficult to attack another country if they fall under the same European Central Bank somehow. But I think what we often forget is that the rest of the world is not like that. And for a long time we thought, just it's sufficient that we, the EU, we are what we are, and the others, they are also rational people. They will look at this and they will say, oh yes, this is the way ahead, we'll move in the same direction. But they haven't, of course, because their circumstances are different. And so sadly in the world around us, there are still players who use power also very aggressively. And so I think we have to balance the two. Our own model, but which you can't just transplant to another place of the world. So we must also have, in a way, the power at least to defend ourselves, to deal with that, with that other part of the world.
Would you maybe say something about, your personal encounters? Because of us three, you probably came closest to the traditional political power, because you worked in a ministry.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I did work in the Ministry of Finance from 2009, in fact, until
here
2014. Yes, here in Luxembourg. So it was really the beginning of the financial crisis, and I had the opportunity to work closely also with the Minister of Finance then. It was very interesting to see how, when you are put in a position of challenges, of a crisis, how power then becomes actually something that is very connected with responsibility, because you need to really take in charge a process that is affecting society at large, that is actually questioning the functioning of society. I mean, when we think back about the bank runs, how this whole question of do we let banks that are of systemic nature fail or not, how that really affected also the morale in society, that was a huge responsibility that policymakers had to take on at that point, and also in a moment of some panic. You know, it is not a moment where you can actually say, well, we'll take time and profoundly think about this matter and decide. So there was also the markets that were pressuring. So how do you then use that power in a context that is not ideal to make the best decisions for that time? So it was interesting to see how then policymakers deal with that, because then power, as I said, is responsibility, it's pressure, often it's also fear. But then you have some that deal with it in a more humble way than others. Some become personally attached to it, others don't. So that personal dimension then also comes into play and affects the quality of that decision-making process. And for having been part of many meetings where policymakers would meet, it was very interesting to see that when discussions took place in a certain context, environment, with certain attitudes, the decisions that came out, you know, were obviously impacted by that mindset. I mean, you remember how Greece was affected, how the Spanish financial sector, the Irish, Portugal, etc. So all of these were very personal, very emotional discussions, where policymakers had to really, to some extent, have a discipline not to let their personal bias affect the use of power that they were elected to represent at that moment. And everyone deals with it in an extremely different way.
Although there was also a risk of the opposite at the time. I think that it would become a purely technocratic exercise. And I remember debates about how far can you go to force a state like Greece to cut back on its social welfare, for example. Because I remember writing at that time a paper saying, yeah, there's no point in saving the euro at the price of destroying the welfare state, because the euro is not an objective in its own right. The welfare state is, in my view. So if you have to destroy it in order to save it, you know, that's like Vietnam. In order to save the village from communism, we bombed it into the earth. Yeah, perhaps not. So I found that at the time very, very tricky. It linked back, Sarah, to what you said about the moral framework, in my view, or the project. You have to know very well, what is the actual objective here? Right? There's no point saving only the banking system if the price is you destroy the buying power, that's the word power again, of every individual citizen. It's also linked, one more word, to my geopolitical take, because that's also the year 2007-8, the financial crisis, to which you can date the breakthrough of China as a great power. Since then, indisputably, China is again a great power. Sorry.
Just to build on what you said, this question of power also had an other dimension that I found very interesting to observe, is that, I mean, one says money is power, but I could literally see it happen. So a country starts to lose power because it is losing its money. And somehow that then also made it lose its voice. And how is that working out, especially in the context of the European Union? At some point we were just talking about Greece, not with Greece anymore. You know, and so we took that power away because we felt that Greece owes us. And I was always wondering whether that is actually right. You know, is that correlation that we created, are these consequences, are they morally right? Just a question.
Can you maybe go more in detail? Can you tell something about, you know, did banks, for instance, or investment funds go bankrupt in Luxembourg at the time, in those years? Or was it just a threat from outside?
So Luxembourg, back in the day, decided to intervene. The government did rescue one or the other bank, except in one very specific case, which also was not of systemic nature, there where it was feared that it could have a larger impact, the government did intervene. But that question was open for every country to decide, and we also know from other countries that other decisions were taken. So that question of at what point do you intervene and let also some events, you know, go their course, natural course of let's say, construction, deconstruction, was also interesting to see how far do you use that power to prevent certain things from happening. In Luxembourg, in any case, the government or policymakers decided that it was in the national interest not to let certain consequences unfold. But we know that this was not the case in all the countries.
Yeah.
Were they these interventions followed by a policy of long-term austerity, like in many other countries, or how did that work out?
So during that time in Luxembourg, I would not say austerity, but there was definitely a policy of budgetary discipline, where there was a prudent policy that was adopted, but it was also a policy that was going beyond just budgetary measures, but also trying to redefine a model for the financial sector. And I think this is a reflection that many other financial sectors were also engaged in. What is the place of finance in a world that is growing out of this financial sector, and also in a very regulated environment? I think this is something that we still are trying to adjust to. Ever since the crisis, we also have a European framework that is extremely dense. I would say that has a lot of power, and some would even say, is it legitimate or not? Because we all know that these institutions are not elected institutions. So I think you can really go into some detail here to see what are the consequences of this crisis that in fact has created an infrastructure that is huge and powerful in Europe.
I found it quite surprising at the time that one could even talk of the possibility of, for example, Greece being pushed out of the Eurozone, because in my view the EU is not just an organization, it's a state-like organization. It's somewhere in between an organization that you can join but also leave again, and a state. And a state you don't just join and leave, not just like that, you know, as the UK has now found out. So I think in many ways, I mean, my country, Belgium, in many ways we're a province of the EU, of the single market, of the Eurozone. You're a province of it, and you implement what's decided at the central level. You know, so I mean, no American would conceive that as a result of the financial crisis, you would have to push Texas out of the Union, right? So that we conceived of pushing Greece out, I found very, very disturbing in a way, because my desired end state is the United States of Europe. Also because, in my view, that's the only way to aggregate power in sufficient strength is at the central level, not in every field. But if we have to hold our own in a world of intense competition between China, Russia, the US, if we have to hold our own in a technological race and economic race, then I think we need to centralize in some areas much more than we do.
So how does the internet play into all this?
Yeah, there is a fintech turn, and yeah, I've been very much a part of that since 2013. We have an international network called Money Lab, and these are a lot of around, let's say, 800 or 1,000 artists around the globe who work on these issues. So it's a network of investigative journalists, researchers, artists, but also activists. And yeah, the financialization or the monetization of the internet is in our circles seen as a very good thing. First of all, it radically breaks with the dogma of Silicon Valley, which sorted out a very sneaky business model for itself, namely to give away all the services for free, and in exchange, get your data behind your back, right? And this what we call, economy of the free, luckily is now slowly coming to an end. It took really long time, and a lot of people are still hooked, to the social media, and that's still the case. But let's say the financialization or monetization of the internet is in general considered as a very good and radical answer to break the power of Silicon Valley. Also because they are not at all involved. They were asleep. They are still defending their monetary system, the old model. So they are not at all involved in the new solutions.
Could you give a concrete example here of what that means?
What it means?
A concrete example of the monetization.
Yeah, well, but also just go to China.
Yeah.
I go to China and look at how the platforms there are fully monetized, and people can trade, they can sell goods, and there's a fully functioning payment system which the Americans have always blocked and are still blocking to this day. And that is also the explanation, let's say, why since let's say 2009-10, coinciding with the last financial crisis, Bitcoin grew so rapidly, and the whole crypto blockchain developed more or less as a completely parallel system, primarily because Silicon Valley refused to implement it, and they refuse it up to today, right? So today we have a system that is completely free, which is ad-based, and we have this very strange, what I call right-wing populist crypto dream, which is primarily, against the state, against not only the state banks and their fiat money, but it's also against the traditional banks. Unfortunately, this whole crypto thing is not going into a direction that is now implemented in China. So China is really way ahead in this sense that we in the West have this kind of dual system of an internet that is free, and kind of half-hearted attempts to implement some payment systems in which some banks are involved, but the traditional banks are also very cautious, and they don't really want, they want to keep control. In the back there are of course the American credit card companies that also don't want any peer-to-peer payment systems to be implemented. So on the West side, it's a very, very chaotic picture. Whereas if you look at the way that, for instance, in China these platforms are implemented, there's a much more integrated idea. Now, I'm not saying that it's going there like hunky-dory, that the Communist Party is now intervening, and it's intervening precisely at the level that it's caused by this venture capital-backed American system, in which systems grow very, very fast, and you create monopolies and very, very rich, founders, and a very, very small group of ultra-rich people. And China, the Communist Party, is now trying to do away with that kind of very speculative monopoly side. But in general, we see that in China, let's say, ordinary people have much more possibilities to set up their own e-commerce and payment systems, whereas here in the West it's still very much in the hands of traditional banks.
For me, it somehow makes me think that still the natural incumbent of power is the state, and that in the end that's still the most legitimate actor, and if it acts, it can really wield its power, because you often hear, oh well, but the big IT giant and so on, they are replacing the state. The internet has democratized power, but I don't buy that. I think, for example, the Googles and the Microsofts, they become very powerful because we've let them. But if the state says tomorrow it's finished, we can do that. But we or some policymaker just don't want it. But for me, the state, it's still a world of states, and I think it will be for a long time to come. And even in the cyber world, it's the most powerful states that wield the most power in the cybersphere, logically, because you need resources also to develop that. But oh, sorry.
No, I'm just thinking, you know, and listening to the two of you, and trying to put it also again in a context of how our understanding of power has maybe evolved over the past centuries to some extent. It seems that we think of the power system of always suggesting that there is a hierarchy of the powerful, and then there is those who have no power. So basically, you know, there are different categories, but even within those that have power, there are differences. There are those that have more power than others. And I'm trying to think whether at this point also in society, whether we don't need to rethink completely and profoundly this way of organizing society. You know, what would a world look like where nation states actually have, you know, equal power in the sense that they are equal peers, where the point is not to compete against each other, but to work together towards something common. You know, what would happen to the concept of power if we would think of the world like that? Or even, you know, among people, where it is less about having power over something or somebody, but it's more about empowerment.
Or power too.
Or power too. And maybe it's important. Of course, we observe things and we conceptualize them, but then also how are we trying to rethink the system? Because we also see that it's not a perfect system. It is a very dysfunctional system. And then why is it that society today is starting to think like that? And why didn't they think of it 500 years ago? You know, what has changed today? What is in our awareness different? And also our level of maturity. And it starts, let's say, in the family, where we have children today that challenge, if to some extent, the power or the authority of parents because they want to be treated differently. Now, 500 years ago, that probably wasn't the case. So also to look at how is society at large maturing, and how is this maturity affecting the way we look at concepts that have always been there, have always been implemented in a certain way, and is that way today still valid?
Somehow I doubt that there will be any great change, because we're not in a Greek city-state anymore, you know, where you can say at that time, well, every male citizen, which includes a lot of people, well, half of people, already all the women, but also all the non-citizens, okay, you could bring them together physically and discuss everything if you wanted. But I think, you know, representative democracy, you know, I'm with Churchill, you know, it's the worst system except for all the others, because I don't think you cannot be strategic if you have to at any moment decide everything with everybody. Then you're always, then you end up in ad hocery. I think that's my fear then. So again, if you need to have power, also requires consistency and the sort of confidence. Okay, I have a certain amount of time to develop my project. If whatever I decide can be revoked because tomorrow someone calls a referendum, then nobody can ever get anything done. So you build in breaks into the system, right? In our system, it's the elections every 4 or 5 years. Some dictatorships manage to organize that too, right? In the Chinese system, until now, they had discovered a way, because every dictatorship struggles with the same problem, the succession, right? If Putin has a heart attack this afternoon, who will be a successor? Nobody knows. Maybe they have a guy there hiding behind the curtains, but we don't know. For all we know, there'll be a huge succession crisis. And Chinese had a system that said 2 terms, and your second term, we prepare the next one. Xi Jinping is now breaking through that by going for a third term. But that also was a break. Even in an authoritarian system, you know that power, you have a finite amount of time to use it. So still, I'm not a big fan of referenda, the vox populi, all kinds of direct democracy. I think it sounds nice, but to me it stops you from actually exercising power. Also exercising it for the good.
Just to clarify, this is not what I was suggesting.
Yeah.
I was not suggesting direct democracy. I was just suggesting at a level of system.
Yeah.
To think of the possibility of what a world would look like where the US, China, Russia, and the rest of the world would actually, a little bit like it was thought of in the European Union, speak at level playing field, equal footing. What would happen to that world where and it has nothing to do with democracy as such. I mean, you were talking about legitimate governance here, but what would happen to the order also in the world, to the way countries would interact with each other, and then therefore also the people in these countries, if it was less about fighting each other, but more about working together towards a common cause. And if you think of power being something like this, it becomes a very positive thing.
It looks, I mean, this leads us back to the concert of powers that we had in the 19th century. You know, after defeat of Napoleon, Congress of Vienna, the powers sort of organized a system for Europe. And of course, those same powers then all developed an imperialist project and began to control the rest of the world. But to an extent, it worked within Europe. But again, it meant, of course, that those few great powers, 5, 6, they decided the fates of the smaller states, right? When Belgium separated from the Netherlands, it was up to them. They decided we accept it or we don't. It was not up to the Dutch or the Belgians in the end. What I think we could achieve today, when we have, for the moment, 4 big global players, China, Russia, US, EU, is a concert of powers, but embedded within strong multilateral institutions. So the great powers, they have to take the lead because they have the scale to do that, but working also for the others, not just deciding over the other, but working with the others within the multilateral system. I think that's the best we can hope for in the current setup. And I would say I always distinguish between competition and rivalry. I think competition between states is inevitable, just like in the economy. If I open a supermarket on one corner of the street, I'm competing with you if you open on the other corner of the street, but doesn't mean we're enemies. So a state, every state is looking for export markets, for natural resources, for influence. It doesn't mean that the other state is also looking to increase its export is your enemy, because sometimes your interests overlap and you compete, you cooperate at the same time. But rivalry is something else. That means that I decide not only to defend my interests, but that I actively try to undermine yours on purpose. And that's something that we ought to try to abstain from, because that's pure negative power, right? And I think what we are missing a bit on the Europeans and certainly Americans is our positive project, right? I think far often the Americans say, well, we're not China, we're against China, so you have to be with us. And other countries say, yeah, but China has a lot to offer, a Belt and Road Initiative, investment, so there's an offer on the table. You're against China, okay, but what's your offer for us? What's your positive project? But it's very easy to fall into this Cold War rhetoric of us against them, and then you don't get that cooperation or that concert.
Yeah, I don't believe in competition. It's simply not happening on the internet. And it's a classic example why this neoliberal idea of competition and the market, is simply not there. So we have near monopolies that once you are inside that monopoly, you can open your shop and you can open yours, but you do that inside Amazon, right? So so this is not a market, and the internet has not fostered any market, right? So in that sense, yeah, the competition is in fact completely absent, and the economies of scale are such that it constantly creates, let's say, new monopolies. And okay, so yeah, there is this kind of strange competition also within us, within my generation, within the people who build up the internet, between this dream of the decentralized, distributed nature of the networks and the ugly reality of platform capitalism, in which there are only very, very few monopoly players, which then decide inside that platform your fate, if your small shop is going to make it or not. So this is kind of the what I call platform realism. So this is kind of maybe the realpolitik, if you like, versus the idealists that hang on to this original idea that there might be a decentralized peer-to-peer possibilities in which also we can redistribute the wealth that is created, right? And that position, is in fact becoming weaker and weaker. And in fact, there isn't at that level. There's no concept anymore about counterpower, right? There is this idea is simply not existing anymore, right? So in the times when when labor and the working class was fighting the industrialists, the robber barons, and the bourgeoisie, there was a very clear idea of organization, social organization. And this idea, of course, has completely faded away in the 60s, and then after 68 and the trauma of 68, especially in the 70s, right? And this is where my generation comes in, that we only see a kind of a fading away of the notion of a vital counter power in society, right? If we are thinking today, if I'm honest, in Europe, but also on the level of the nation states about counterpower, we primarily think of populist, national, right-wing, xenophobic movements. And in Europe, they are the only, let's say, real counterpower that we have seen over the last 10, 20 years.
But do you think the state itself could be that counterpower in Europe, I mean? To break some of the monopoly?
Issue is the state has withdrawn on so many levels, right? And given all its vital functions to the market, and to reintroduce a notion of the state. Yeah, maybe we could say with Gandhi, the Western state, it's a good idea. But seeing is believing. For many people, the state has withdrawn and is no longer absent. And the farmers are really very clear about this.
Although with the whole Corona crisis now, you saw that in the end the state has to take control.
A return. That's definitely true. And we're very, we're only 1.5 years into that. And it's an interesting question, if Corona will provoke this return of the state.
Because you see that classically in times of crisis, in times of war, the state takes control of the economy gradually. And if that war becomes all-absorbing, then the state mobilizes all the resources. And so in a time of crisis too, you saw in the end the state stepping in. But I wonder whether we can make it more permanent. Sometimes it strikes me that we very easily criticize China, say, oh, there are state-owned companies and state this, and ipso facto it is bad. But I'm thinking, well, not necessarily, and we tend to forget that many, all European countries organized a planned economy after the war to kickstart their economy. I'm not saying we have to go back to nationalizing the coal mines and so on, but somehow we're now at the other extreme and we're so stuck. I always irritate lots of people, and then I remember giving a talk for the America-China Chamber of Commerce, and when you say that, well, maybe the answer is not to berate China for having so many state-owned companies, or not only, but also to organize our own state intervention where it's necessary. People can get very, very excited, but I think it's what we need to do, especially then again at the level of Europe, create a scale, and then intervene a lot more actively where that's necessary, would be my take. But I'm not sure whether
you must really inform us, because tell us what is being discussed in the board of directors of banks today.
Maybe just before I answer that, what I thought was very interesting in the financial crisis is that when it really came down to it, when the crisis was especially acute, as let's say, for instance, in Italy at some point, there was a big issue. The government was replaced by a technical government. I don't know if you remember that. So and it was called, and that was the solution for national unity. Something similar was done in Greece. And I was always wondering, so what does that say about our systems? That when really it comes down to an existential crisis, we actually put our political system to the side, and we decide that we need to all be unified, because otherwise it's not going to work. And so how do we, what learning do we draw from that? So on the one hand, of course, it is very important that as human beings we learned to express ourselves, and we are emancipated, and we don't have oppressive systems anymore that kind of prevent from freedom of expression to take place. But on the other hand, I think we need to seriously question whether freedom of expression comes through opposition. That is the point I'm trying to make also when I want to think of a system, a model of collaboration rather than of opposition. And I did that experience when I was in the ministry. Sometimes a policy was defined, and then you would discuss with stakeholders, and basically behind the doors some would say, I actually agree with you, but outside I can't say that. So I'm thinking, how does that make sense? How is that actually an expression of someone's position? It's not. It has become a trap. So in this, and this is why I want to point it out, because these are the incoherences or the imperfections of a system that has a lot of good things, but on the other hand also has developed some aspects that are actually preventing us from moving on. That is just also maybe in questioning the model, and this is why I wonder, for instance, do we actually need a counterpower? And I thought it was interesting in Samuel Huntington's book Clash of Civilizations, how it actually clarifies that we have lived until now let's say history of defining ourselves by negation. So I am not you, but who am I? As you said, we don't want China, we don't want this, but then who are we actually? How do we now go from a state of mind where we reject what we are not to a state of mind where we first of all welcome who you are, but then also define proactively who we are? That seems to be quite a challenge in the way we also look at power, because it has always been used as a tool to protect, a tool to reject, a tool to impose. But how can it be a tool to communicate, to develop, to construct, to build? So I'm just trying to put all of this in the context also of experiences that I've made. What you now ask is a completely different subject, because when what I'm seeing now, and I actually find it fascinating, this is one of the reasons why I decided to become an independent director, is now the power of good governance, as you would call it. So, and you can look at it at a level of a financial institution or a country or any other sector. I don't think it's specific now to banks. But what does organizational health mean? And what does this health in a non-physical term actually mean? who needs to do what and decide what for the whole to function in an organized, structured, and healthy way. What is the role of a board of directors vis-à-vis operational management, vis-à-vis every single person in that institution for the whole to work? And we are, of course, now with the financial crisis, it has become much more present, and we are more aware of it. What is the role of that entity up there that, you know, is in charge of policy and strategy and the financial performance of an institution? What have they been doing until now, and how can they not take on that responsibility they have and actually really steer the boat? And what kind of a power is that? And how do you construct that power in a way that it is also legitimate and it's reality connected? Because one of the problems that we often have when we talk about power is that we also feel that those who have power don't necessarily understand reality. They are not in the field. Then they are not close to the needs of society, of a bank, etc. So I think also there that concept of power is being redefined, but in a context of how does the collective work. And of course, in a bank, you have everyone has one objective. In any company, that would be the case. It's survival. It's performance. It's making sure that entity is doing well. And how can all the protagonists in this governance model actually contribute to that, and not just some parts, and others basically just have the power but don't exercise that responsibility in a wise way. So also in that sphere, this concept is being completely redefined.
But is that because of pressure from outside? Do you think this good governance is a response, let's say, to, well, let's talk about LuxLeaks, let's talk about the Panama Papers and the recent Pandora Papers. I mean, there, you know, if you open any of them, there are numerous, you know, references to, in fact, the place where we are now, to Luxembourg, also to the Netherlands, of course. You know, the discussions in the Netherlands are, you know, on the same level. Belastingparadijs. Yeah, I mean, or narco state, which is kind of, you know, the next chapter of that. So not just a taxation heaven, but in fact an active involvement in you know, in illicit money laundering, and do you feel that pressure, and is it PR related, or would you say it goes beyond the image?
No, it definitely goes beyond. I mean, concretely, if you look at how the financial ecosystem has evolved, you have regulators that are now very deeply looking into the inner life of financial institutions to see how are they doing their business, how clean is that business, are they complying with regulation, etc. So there's a lot at stake. Then the question is, who's responsible for that? And I think as our concept of responsibility and liability has developed over the past years, so also has this governance model had to evolve. 10 years ago, sitting on the board of directors of a bank meant something completely different than today. You actually today feel very responsible, and sometimes people tell me, but are you crazy to do that? Because you're going to be liable for what is happening in that bank, and do you have the tools to be liable, to know what is happening in a bank? So I think our understanding of what it means and to have a governance model that acts responsibly is evolving because of the context that you mentioned, and public opinion wants that. But what's the issue at stake? What's the deeper root of that phenomenon? And it goes to a certain expectation of ethical behavior in the world of finance, but also vis-a-vis people that are considered to be wealthy and rich. You know, and then we're very close to the concept of social justice. You know, what do I consider to be just or not just? Is it fair that you pay your taxes here and someone else pays his taxes elsewhere? What does transparency mean? what does it mean to actually establish a concept of finance that is ethical? You know, I am a lawyer, so I am naturally attracted to laws and regulation. But I have to say, the amount of regulation that had to be put in place to regulate human behavior, I wonder, is that really necessary? Is that the only tool we have to suggest that some things need to be done in a very ethical way? Is there no other framework that we can think of than the regulatory framework? What happened to you know, a common set of principles in society? You know, if we all had the same concept of let's say, you know, paying our taxes like every citizen would, we wouldn't need to have all this regulation. And I'm just picking one. I'm not even talking about financial crime like money laundering and financing of terrorism and fraud, etc. I mean, those are extreme things. But this tax transparency concept is something that affects every single person. It is a much broader issue. This is where everyone has an opinion about. We're not talking about just a few criminals that are going around and that are a select group of people.
I think it leads you back, you already mentioned here, to talk about the labor movement, and if it leads you back to the very beginning of the labor movement in the 19th centuries, where what they asked was regulation, laws, because it's the laws that create the freedom. And I fear it's not realistic to think that the common sense of purpose or values will be sufficient, because you will always have people who will be then driven by selfish motivations, you know. So where you have laws, then it actually creates power for those who operate within the regulated system, I would say. So you have to know what society you want. When I teach about strategy, I always say rule number one of writing strategy is know yourself. Know, who do I want to be? Which kind of society do I want to be? Because if you don't know that, you also don't know what you're defending, actually, you know, or what you are promoting, what you're trying to export. So you have to know that yourself. And then I would say what distinguishes the way of life that we've built within the EU, broadly speaking, and for me, the key notion is equality. Of course, not total equality, so it doesn't mean everybody has to have the exact same level of prosperity. But equality in terms of everybody participates in political decision making, everybody has equal opportunity to be educated, everybody is equally protected by the state, and everybody gets a fair enough share of prosperity so that he and she can really take part in society in the way they want. I think for me that notion of equality ought to be the principle that binds us, and that maybe provides the ethical dimension that you refer to, that inspires regulation. But it seems to me that we've become afraid of saying that we push it aside a little bit, as if equality is a luxury product. It's nice to have when things are going well, but when you're in crisis and you sacrifice it. Or I would say no, it's the other way around. The point is equality, and the worse things go, the more you must maintain it, right? And we already talked about the European project that is sort of a peace project, you know, keep war out of Europe. But for me, that was always only ever half of it, because it's the same founding fathers of the Union who also built the welfare state after the Second World War. And for me, the two went hand in hand. You make sure there is no war among the states, and to keep the state stable internally, we had the welfare state. I think those two, peace and equality, I would say that's the core of who we are as Europeans. And again, you need power to implement it and to enforce it and to safeguard it from any external threats. And don't be too shy about it, I would say. I would almost dare to say don't be too American about it.
Yeah, I would like to bring in a term we haven't really talked about yet, and that's the term that is associated with power from the very beginning. namely sovereignty.
Mhm.
And of course, there is sovereignty on many different levels, right? I'm not so interested in the, let's say, the classic definition of the king and queen and monarchy, or you know, this kind of very traditional political definition of sovereignty. I think today there are different manifestations, and I would say, and many have pointed at that, especially in the COVID crisis, right? There was a lack of European sovereignty, right? It couldn't produce its own things. It had outsourced all its production elsewhere in the world, and many people were kind of longing for a redefinition of fields in which, you know, we were in charge, and we were able to, let's say, you know, produce the vital goods and services that were required. And of course, yeah, especially in my field, we know, you know, there's not just China that's now the global factory. There's also something like, you know, outsourcing, yeah? Especially also very strong in the financial sector, of a lot of work that is being done, in fact, elsewhere outside of the EU, and it is this kind of lack of sovereignty that very often leads to a feeling of insecurity, of precarity, of feeling of you know, financial insecurity. And my question really is, does it make sense to reintroduce this idea of a sphere of sovereignty, for instance, you know, in your field of finance, or in your field of the, let's say, the military and foreign policy levels? Because on the technological and internet level, the answer is straight out yes. We need data sovereignty in Europe. We need tech sovereignty also on the level of data centers, hardware, you name it.
There's now this enormous debate on the EU about strategic autonomy. Because sovereignty, I would say, has two dimensions. You have the capacity to take your own decisions, then the capacity to implement them yourself also. And in many areas we're lacking that, right? And so you need to pool your sovereignty in a way at the European level in many areas to regain it. The military field is the example par excellence. You know, if I look at my country, Belgium, okay, we can in all freedom decide not to do something in the military field. But if you want to actually do something, then you realize Belgium alone, there's only one military operation that we can do strictly by ourselves. That's the annual National Day Parade. We don't need anybody, we just need people to come and watch it. That's it. So you're sovereign in the sense you take your own decision, but you're not sovereign in the sense that you have no strategic autonomy. You cannot implement them. The answer is to pool it. But then strangely you hit nationalism again. And I think sometimes the EU has made a mistake by presenting itself as a post-national project. And we said, you know, to feel Polish or to feel French, that's old-fashioned. You should forget about it. But it's strong. It's there. You can't wish it away. It's a strong emotion. Perhaps not in Belgium. You know, the Belgians are the least patriotic, because we're all unpatriotic together. That still makes us patriotic somehow. Anyway, that's another discussion. Maybe we should have said, you know, as EU, by all means, don't be a nationalist, because nationalist is more negative for it. It's me against someone else. But be a patriot. It's me for a project. So be a Polish patriot, be a French patriot, but it's no longer enough. So in addition, be a European patriot and do at that level, create a sovereignty at a level where you can exercise it, right? And the EU has the principle of subsidiarity, the lowest possible level, fine. You don't need to bring everything together in Brussels. But think about it, that you may be a Polish patriot or a French patriot, and so you may think to gain power back from the EU, but gaining stuff back from the EU probably means opening the road for China. Maybe not the best way. So maybe European sovereignty is indeed what we need in many areas. I would entirely agree.
This also leads to the question, if we need to re-industrialize Europe, away maybe. I'm looking at you. Away from the financial services, or maybe finance with a purpose, or where and that debate, of course, is strong when we're bringing in climate change and all the catastrophes ahead. Where people ask the question, can finance, play a positive role there in this very, very urgent transition that we need to somehow organize, and can this go hand in hand, for instance, with a reindustrialization of Europe, or is this a project that we simply have to forget about and accept that, for instance, China is the global factory, and that we will not have anything to say anymore about that specific part of our lives, of society.
It's an interesting question. I just to come back to the word that you used earlier, sovereignty, and trying to understand it in maybe in a new way in this context. It is very close to what I called earlier, just taking responsibility again, and it's not an exclusive thing. It's not because I'm sovereign that you can't be sovereign. So I think it's also interesting to think again of how sovereignties, because I think that the sovereign nation state is the most efficient system that we have developed. But how can we still perfect it, and how can we create a model of sovereignties again that take responsibility? Because I think what is sometimes misunderstood is, and you talked about layers, is that things are not necessarily dichotomies. They can coexist. I can be sovereign, you can be sovereign, and there cannot be another layer of sovereignty above as well. We can be part of the European Union and the UN and be sovereign states. That collaborative system does not exclude that one has the possibility to decide and do things. It just creates a framework for that. That's what it fundamentally does. So I think to put it back into a context of giving power back somehow, where we think that we don't have power anymore, and I think it's wrong to think that. I think, in fact, sometimes it's also maybe just an excuse not to take responsibility, to blame it on someone else doing something. I mean, there are many different reasons why both states and people do or don't do things. So I very much like this idea of connecting this concept in a new way to power and to responsibility as one coherent framework. You mentioned the role of finance in this context. I mean, you know that in the EU we talk about green finance now quite a lot, and the European Commission has put forward actually a great deal of regulation, very dense, very detailed, and that this will be a huge workload for the financial sector to implement. So there is that awareness that also policies need to be coherent. And this has been, for instance, one of the challenges at the European level. You have a policy for this and a policy for that, and another policy. So you have now policies that are starting to converge. When you talk about the environment, we cannot not talk about finance because it's one of the tools. So and I think that is a positive thing. Again, it doesn't take away from the validity, autonomy of a policy. It just creates it in a larger context. On a very, very different subject, I've been following a little bit how the policy on migration is also evolving. And interesting enough, there has been an effort now to link it to a policy on agriculture. And it wasn't done until now. So also creating this coherence between policies makes the policies much more powerful. Because if we start seeing how they impact each other, we can create a coherence that makes them all much more effective. So I see also in that approach actually something very powerful, and I think that we need to pursue it a lot more, because we do create incoherences in the way we approach certain subjects, and we're realizing that this is impossible to do. And the fact that we have now really also coined this concept of green finance with all the detail that's in it, it is a very interesting step in absolutely the right direction.
Can you maybe split it up a little bit? Because green finance to me sounds a bit like, well, the banking sector itself needs to become more energy efficient, and
it's more about products.
Yeah.
So what products do you invest in?
Not that. Yeah.
No, it's also that. Of course, also, financial institutions need to look at their own use and investments, but then it's also about the product offer that you develop. And that you offer, and then what are you going to focus on? And of course, also investment in the environment has very many different degrees. And, and what do you look like? A company can invest in different areas. What percentage do I need to consider? I mean, with all the discussions that we have also about energy. There is a transition that you want to also respect, that an industry is also trying to adapt to new sources of energy. So how does the world of finance accompany that transition by focusing on the products that actually promote a certain type of energy? It's not an easy decision, and I'm very and it's the beginning of it. So this is happening right now. Where banks are reconsidering their product offer, reconsidering their own approach, and deciding their level of ambition. We also talk about ESG, which has the E for environment, the S for social, the G for governance. It's part of that thinking of how some elements of our policies are interconnected, that we cannot. And I had an interesting discussion with a bank, in fact, in Russia, that said that if we now pull out of this type of energy, we will create a social crisis. So that cannot be good, especially not in the short term. It might be necessary to consider that, but then how can we create transitions where we allow for a whole industry to adapt its approach? This is why I point out this question of coherence, because you can create undesired side effects that are actually not really side effects, that can have a huge impact.
Remember, this is one of the dogmas of Silicon Valley, right? And this has been very, very big, in fact, hegemonic in all business literature, to preach the disruption. And disruption has been, the key word of the last 10, 15 years. So why not disrupt the energy sector, Tell me. Yeah, sorry. But this has been, what has been driving, let's say, venture capital-led investments for a really long time. The idea was consciously to let's say accelerate the disruption of entire societies and social structures.
That's a good question.
Your Russia example is interesting because it goes to show that one is sometimes afraid of having too powerful neighbors. but we're also worried about neighbors that lose so much power that they implode, which creates problems of its own, right? And again, it leads you back to someone has to be in charge somewhere, ideally the state, in order to keep things stable and maybe somewhat predictable. And sometimes maybe we wonder whether we're not all powerless in the face of the big global challenges. We just talked about migration, which would be an enormous challenge, especially for Europe, I think. Demographics, economic development in Africa, depopulation, and climate, of course. But to me, at the same time, it reinforces me in my idea that still, therefore, states remain important, and great power politics remains vital, because it will be very difficult to effectively tackle any of those if you don't have the big players with you. You know, you're not going to tackle climate change if China says, "No, we don't care." No, luckily they begin to care, if only for domestic reasons, and the CCP wants to stay in power. But so, or maybe this is a story I tell myself, and then while everybody is working on new topics like climate, I work on old-fashioned topics like geopolitics and great powers. Maybe one topic that we really haven't tackled is the most absolute use of power is to make war and to kill somebody. And it's a very sensitive one, of course. And is this an instrument that we Europeans, that we still need, and that we occasionally need to deploy outside our borders? You know, and if so, under which circumstances? It's a very tricky debate. You know, my line is always, we need, as Europeans, a credible power projection capacity, the capacity to project force into our periphery, but to use it as little as we can. But if you don't have it, which is the case today, then other players will not take us into account, because they will say, well, whatever we do, the Europeans, they will not interfere. So occasionally they cross our red lines, and we are obliged to intervene, but we're not well prepared for it. Whereas I think if we would have a more credible capacity, but also a credible will to use it, some of the actors around us would maybe take us more into account. But what are the red lines? Very tricky question. Our discourse is always the same. If we do occasionally use military force outside our borders, somehow we always feel obliged. It's because we're bringing democracy and human rights. But A, that's not true. Usually that's a side effect of an intervention, but it's rarely the only reason why we deploy somewhere. We go somewhere because our interests are threatened. Two, the risk is that if you declare every war to be a war for democracy and human rights, that every war becomes a war without ends. Without end, because, you know, when will a place like Mali, for example, ever be democratic enough to pull out, you know? Or you end up in the situation of Afghanistan, you pull out after 20 years and you go exactly back to the status quo ante, exactly to where we were. So it's a tricky debate for Europe, because as we already mentioned a few times now, the EU per se is a peace project that's about peace among ourselves, but there is not peace everywhere around us. So do we still need the capacity to make war when it is forced upon us, so to say?
Yeah, from my perspective, of course, there is the cyber war, cyber warfare, you know, which is now an integral part of the internet business. And yes, there are, you know, the very harmful, let's say, militarized drones, but you know, there's also another type of economic warfare with ransomware. It's a whole spectrum, in fact, which is happening and which is kind of replacing the old Cold War techniques. So the Cold War was usually done with espionage and with of course a great deal of propaganda, and occasionally, of course, also in fact real warfare, maybe not in the center of Europe, but elsewhere. And this is kind of what I what I see happening. Definitely the war theater, is changing.
I would not say that it replaces it. I think it just added to it, and all the other stuff is also still happening. And classically, what you see, let's compare the people. First we just fought wars on land, then we learned how to sail. We began to fight wars on sea. Then we invented the airplane, and we began to make war from the air. In the beginning, you always have people, get the air theorists of the 1920s, say, the future war will be fought only from the air. No, you still fight it on sea and on land as well. And I think now it's the same. It's another dimension now. Cyber is there, and so we begin to make war in cyber. But it's added to all the rest. And it makes it, of course, very expensive for states because, for example, the Belgian Armed Forces has obviously an army, navy, and air force. Now the Minister of Defense decided to create this kind of cyber force. And so it may, but the old techniques sadly don't disappear, I fear. And espionage is still, certainly Brussels is often called the espionage capital of Europe because everybody is there, and so all the spies are there.
Yeah, but the warfare. Yeah, I mean, I'm often think about this case. I have good friends in Taiwan, and this is very much on my mind.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you read a little bit about the debates currently happening in the U.S. and will we go, into war for Taiwan, and what is it worth World War III to defend that particular island, and what are the stakes in fact. And I think that will be with us for the next couple of years when we're talking about military power. I think the Taiwan test case is going to be quite an interesting one, because a lot of people say that the West will not really care about Taiwan, right? And so, what does that mean? What does it mean that we don't really care? I'm quite intrigued about that.
We care, but not at any price. It's an issue I follow because my husband is from Taiwan, actually. Mm. So, and I think few people on Taiwan itself expect that US would go to war with China when push comes to shove. But what we could signal, I think, is that if China were to, let's say, change the status quo by force of arms, it would totally change our relations with China. Because, I mean, my point of view is China is a great power, that's normal. Given its size, given its history, it would be strange if it were not a great power. In itself, it's not problematic, it depends what they do with that power. If they use their power more or less within the rules of the game, then I think we can and will have to live with China. But if they decide to become an aggressive military power, then we ought to say, well, we cannot have any economic relations with you. I think the regime in Beijing has to realize it would be an enormous gamble to put all of that on the line. So then the economic dimension of power comes into that. But the question is, will we? Because when Russia invaded Ukraine and took away the Crimea, did we then cancel our economic relationship with Russia? No, but because we applied sanctions against Russia, but carefully isolated the energy sector because of the mutual dependence. So then again you say, yeah, well, the Crimea, they speak Russian anyway, it's been Russian before. And this is how some people may also react about Taiwan. They speak Chinese anyway.
For that matter.
Or Belarus.
Crisis there. I'm wondering, can you say something about the presence of Chinese banks? It's very obvious here in Luxembourg. They are very present here. At the same time, the Chinese banking sector is also facing massive problems, with debt, not just only in the real estate sector, but how do you look at this kind of model of debt-driven banking? What do you make of that?
That's an interesting concept, driven banking. I think that is a global phenomenon. This is the way our financial economic system is built. And you're absolutely right to say that the level of debt is huge, but not just in China. Truly, if you look at the European market, and not just public debt, but also private debt, it is absolutely huge. What do I say about Chinese banks in Europe? Well, it's an interesting market. Chinese banks want to be in Europe, and not just them, other banks as well. And Luxembourg is often considered as a headquarter place to be able to do banking in Europe. So as such, it is absolutely natural and normal that you would find so many Chinese banks, but also other banks, Swiss banks, etc., in Luxembourg, to be able to organize and coordinate banking activities within the EU market from Luxembourg. So this is why they're here, and we're quite happy they're here.
Can you join a board of a Chinese bank?
Well, as a matter of fact, I am on the board of a Chinese bank. I am on the board of ICBC Europe SA, which is the headquarters structure for the branches in the EU. And it's quite interesting to work at that level of the board of directors, to understand the Chinese approach to banking, to also understand how their strategies develop, how they do take interest in the domestic markets. They do want to be part also of the economic reality of the countries that they're in. It's not just about Chinese business, it's also about domestic business, and this is a strategy that I have seen is developing very recently. So,
and is it let's say a traditional Shanghai-based industrial bank, or what type of bank is it?
Well, ICBC is in fact the largest bank in the world.
Yeah.
So, but it is of course like most Chinese banks, the state-owned bank.
Yeah.
Maybe a final question. What power do the three of us think that we each have as an individual? What power do we have, if any? Not much, apparently.
No, in fact, I think this is the most relevant question, because at the end of the day, the question I ask myself is, what can I do?
Mm-hmm.
And this is a question, I mean, I used the word earlier on of empowerment that I like very much, and that I find, in fact, a much more modern concept of power than maybe what we are used to. And as an individual, I need to ask myself, how can I make a contribution every single day to the betterment of the world, for things to improve? And what is my, let's say, sphere of influence? What can I influence? And at the end of the day, it's a sum of a lot of actions in the world that will make a difference, that will make us go into one or the other direction. So as a human being, as a mother, as a friend, as just simply a woman, also in a society where we have still no full equality between men and women. I mean, these are all the dimensions of an identity that one needs to explore, needs to be aware of, and then really think, so what is my very valuable and unique contribution today in this society for us to move a step forward? And of course, everyone has a different answer to that question, but this is today what defines me as a human being. To be able to understand how I can be of service to the betterment of the world, that for me is the most powerful state of mind that I can imagine.
Geert.
Yeah, I think to design and promote critical concepts, I think that's a very, a very deeply European trait, and I think. Well, we're in a contemporary art museum here, and yeah, if we follow Ezra Pound's idea of art as the antenna of the human race, it's really, my task to work with artists and many others to develop those concepts, critical concepts that, in my view, question and dismantle the powers to be, and envision, other worlds. So there's always a speculative element in the concept, and in my case, always also a critical one.
Yeah. Well, myself, one would wish, as a think tanker in a think tank in Brussels, that you have great power to influence the decision makers, but I'm very, very pragmatic about it. I think occasionally, from time to time, you have a powerful idea, between big brackets, that resonates and then sort of begins to circulate of itself. But I've never seen it happen that think tanker A comes up with an idea which leads directly to a decision B. But I say, if you have a good idea, it becomes part of the context within which the decision maker decides. So I think the most power, that is the word that I have, is by teaching. And I like to teach, so it's fun. But this is teaching, and hopefully pushing people to think for themselves. What I also like a lot is not just teaching my Belgian students, but to teach international students. And for example, I think the last thing we should do is to close academic and cultural exchange, because think of a Russian or a Chinese student who spends a semester or a year in Belgium, the Netherlands, or Luxembourg. She will have lived in another system for an entire year, and of course will not go back as a revolutionary, but will have a very, hopefully, a much more nuanced view. So I think teaching and exchanging remains very powerful and very important.
Maybe an additional thought to that. I think as human beings we have one power that distinguishes us from everything else in this world. It's the power to reason. And it's really a capacity that we need to develop far more, and especially in a consumer society where we are trained to be passive. It is a double challenge to use this power to reason. But I like this statement of Einstein. I don't actually know if he said it or not, but I like it anyways, where he said, when we solve problems, we cannot use the same thinking we use when we created them. And I think this is something that we really need to assimilate, that when we look at reality today and we want to make changes, we need to challenge ourselves in our assumptions, in our definitions, and have that capacity to rethink a completely different reality. And I think we have that capacity, and sometimes we don't use it to the fullest, and this would be something that I would at least hope for, that is a power that we would collectively use far more.
Hear, hear. I think we can end on that very positive note. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Geert.
Thank you, both of you.